All right, everybody, welcome back in on the Fly Fantasy Football Podcast, live on the Fantrax Twitter account. That's right, everybody. This is the Fly Fantasy Football Podcast. As you can see by our graphics, Sean Malone, my co-host here. I'm Colin McTammany. He's done a great job updating the graphics here while we go live. So thank you for joining us tonight. Sean, it's been a while. I know we've been kind of going back and forth, sharing the Fly as solo hosts. How you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm glad to be back with you. You were just saying before that kind of feels like it's been a while since we've been together. It hasn't been that long, just 2 weeks, 2 episodes without one another. But, let's get right back to where we left off.
Yeah, and I think in the terms of football and fantasy football, so much has happened that it feels longer. Obviously, without saying here, it is August 2nd. This is draft month, people. I don't know if you draft in September. I know I have a couple drafts in September. I know the season kicks off officially September 7th, but this to me is draft month. I know I've got a home league draft in about 16 days. I know that exactly because it is my home league. I have one with my college buddies a little bit further from that. Tons of best ball stuff. The Fantasy Football Expo is next weekend. I will be in that in Canton, Ohio. What is your favorite draft that you have, Sean, that you're looking forward to this month?
Oh, it's hard to say because all the leagues I'm in have something unique with them, be it my punishment league with my friends out here in Missouri, my family league with, all my family members, which if you know anyone that comes from a big Irish family, just full of grace and humility and kindness in all those leagues, in all those families, and sarcasm as well, if you haven't picked up on that yet. I've got another big money league that I do with a couple buddies of mine from college that were actually on the college's football team. And that's probably the toughest league I'm in because, most leagues, you got someone that, or 2 or 3 people, depending on the size, that don't really know what they're doing. When you've got a large buy-in like this league has where, we're talking 4 digits kind of payout to first place. And everyone played football as well in some capacity, be it high school or at the college level. There's a lot of depth of knowledge in that league from the top of the standings all the way to the bottom, so that makes it the most competitive. So I would say right now, just because I know where my draft slot is, I'm really looking forward to my big money league with my buddies from college. That one is one that I'm really looking forward to. I've got the 8th overall pick out of 12 teams in that one. So I'm looking forward to picking 8th in that league. I think I can get a good team with that quick turnaround to round 2.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect segue into what our episode here on the Fly is tonight, and that is players we cannot stop drafting. Some of you may be just joining us here on the Fly or just getting back into the swing of things for fantasy football, being that it is August and your drafts are this month. Sean and I know, as well as plenty of other fantasy analysts on Fantrax, as well as, across this industry, have been looking at stuff tirelessly all of 2023, even dipping back into 2022. But I feel like the buzz is in the air. Everyone's getting ready for their drafts. So Sean and I specifically are doing mock drafts on fantraxhq.com. Sean has been doing non-PPR leagues. Myself, I have been doing PPR leagues. We've both completed about 5, I think, right? I know I've done 5. Have you done 5 as well?
Yeah,
they're all
and
up.
We've done them differently from one another as well. You're going from 1 through 10. I wanted to be opposite of you and not have the middle couple be right next to each other. So I'm working from the inside out, starting with 6, then 5, 7, and I'm going to end with 10. And my final one will be pick number 1 overall.
Nice. So a little bit of variance there, and you can look at Sean's mock drafts as well as mine and see how things have been changing, obviously with injuries, contract news, etc. There's been a lot of movement in the rankings so far and in our mock drafts. I did a solo podcast here on the Fly last week that covered the first week of training camp. I'll probably do that again for this week because there's been a lot that's gone on. Expect that later this week. But for right now, we are live on the Fly talking about players that we cannot stop drafting in the mock drafts we've done so far. So, Sean, why don't you kick us off? Who is a player that you find on most of your mock draft teams, or someone that you just feel like you can't pass up when you're on the clock?
Yeah, the one I've got that every single time I'm picking, that in some capacity, whether I do take them or I'm at least considering taking them, because I'm trying my best to avoid taking the same players again and again. But when I was thinking of this segment, the first one that came to mind, it's Garrett Wilson. Man, like, and you mentioned how some of the rankings are changing. In some of the earlier mocks, I was able to find him in round 3. In the last one I did, I was really hoping to find him in round 3. I went with the 8th overall pick, Travis Kelsey, and then in round 2, a bit early, but I wanted to make sure I grabbed that stack. I took Patrick Mahomes because I think if you're going to take Kelsey round 1, go all in, double down on that pick, and take Patrick Mahomes early, depending on your league size. But I was hoping Garrett Wilson would be there in round 3. If not, maybe one of the top running backs slips a little bit and falls to me. But Garrett Wilson is one of those that if I wasn't going to take Mahomes in that round, knowing what I know now that he's moving up in draft boards, I think I might take him in round 2. I really think, and it's early. He got injured in camp. He's not expected to miss time, but we haven't seen much of that Rodgers-Wilson connection since the early days. But man, those early days highlights, those look special coming out of Jets camp. And I imagine we're going to see a lot more of that with Hard Knocks coming out. But Garrett Wilson is someone that I've just been in love with. He's got all the opportunity in the world to not just finish as one of the top, but the top wide receiver in fantasy football this year. He was top 10 in targets last year. He only had 4 touchdown receptions. The Jets quarterbacks, they had 4 that threw a different pass last year, 4 different quarterbacks that threw a pass. They were all awful. And even if Aaron Rodgers doesn't return to that peak Aaron Rodgers MVP form, he doesn't need to for Garrett Wilson to finish as the top wide receiver. He can do what he did last year, a little more than 24 touchdowns, about a dozen interceptions, about 4,000 yards, not quite, reaching the 5,000 yard mark like he's capable of when he was at his best. That kind of a season can be enough for Garrett Wilson to finish as the best receiver in fantasy football this year. So count me as all in on Garrett Wilson. I'm big on him this year, and he's someone I've really had a hard time just staying away from because of that.
I have been a couple best ball leagues already. The Scott Fishbowl League that pretty much wrapped up for everyone last month or so. I got him, I think, with my 3rd pick in that league, which is really exciting. It's just always good to invest in players that you want to root for. And that is a guy that I love to root for. Obviously, the reigning offensive rookie of the year. There is such thing as Hard Knocks hype. So I'm sure when that episode 1 debuts next week and we see Garrett Wilson, and I know that catch we all saw, probably, if you haven't seen it, all over the internet, the toe tap in the back of the end zone from Aaron Rodgers. That is going to get people very excited if they're not paying attention to Garrett Wilson just yet. But 6th in targets last year as a rookie amongst wide receivers, just absolutely ridiculous. Like you said, only 4 touchdowns. You have to imagine that's going to go up with Aaron Rodgers. One thing about Aaron Rodgers is that I will say is that Nathaniel Hackett is now his offensive coordinator again. Didn't have him last year in Green Bay. He was the head coach of the Denver Broncos. We all saw how well that went. The 2 years prior, he won MVP back-to-back seasons with Nathaniel Hackett as his offensive coordinator in Green Bay. He says it's one of his favorite. Hackett is one of his favorite coaches. So I think Aaron Rodgers is going to bounce back. I'm not saying he's going to be a top 5, maybe not even a top 10 quarterback for fantasy, but I do think he's going to support a number 1 wide receiver season out of Garrett Wilson. The hype is real. I'm buying in on him as well. It's going to be interesting to see where he's drafted later this month after Hard Knocks. Like I said, the Hard Knocks hype is real, but some people might be a little afraid. He has suffered a low ankle sprain so far in camp. Reports are saying he'll be fine by week 1. I'm not too worried about it. Low, high ankle sprain, not a big deal. But Garrett Wilson, definitely a guy that I'm trying to get on all my rosters. But it's tough because there's so many good receivers going off the board when you can pick him. So
I'll say this about the Hard Knocks hype you're talking about. One of my favorite all-time fantasy football picks was simply Hard Knocks hype, and it was Darren Waller back in his first breakout season with the Raiders. I remember the episode when the Madden Raiders came out, and they were asking all the guys, who's the most underrated guy on the team? Every single person said, it's Darren Waller.
That's early Darren
Nobody
Waller.
can cover Darren Waller. And so that was a year where I was like, in most drafts, unless I had a premier tight end, I was like, yeah, let me throw my final draft pick at Darren Waller at tight end for the Raiders, see how that goes. I had a couple leagues I won because of a pick like that. So, take it with a huge grain of salt, put the information you get into context, but listen, it can be real, the Hard Knocks hype sometimes.
Yeah, I know last year there were a lot of people at the Lions that bought into DeAndre Swift. Raise your hand if you did. I know I did. I was very into DeAndre Swift last year. Didn't have a bad season. He had an
Mhm.
injury riddled season. I think the hype was real with DeAndre Swift. I like DeAndre Swift a lot, but seeing him in Hard Knocks, that got me going a little bit. But Amon-Ra St. Brown, another guy. I remember when he listed all the wide receivers that were drafted ahead of him, and I got hype watching that scene on Hard Knocks last year. And guess what? Amon-Ra St. Brown lived up to the hype, and he's going to again this year. Let's talk about one of the guys I cannot stop drafting. Again, I'm doing the PPR mock drafts. You're doing the non-PPR. Doesn't matter too much for some of the guys on our list here, but it is worth mentioning. And the guy that I want to talk about, and we'll stick with wide receiver here since you just talked about Garrett Wilson. I got Deebo Samuel. I'm still in on Deebo Samuel. And what I love about Deebo Samuel is 2 years ago, before the 2021 season, you could get him about where he's going now ahead of the 2023 season, and he finished as the wide receiver 3. Last season in drafts, you're drafting him as a top 5 guy at the position, and he disappointed. He was a wide receiver 24 on a points per game basis in PPR league. So I actually think Deebo Samuel is a post-hype sleeper this year, a guy that you can get in the 4th, 5th round, maybe, depending on who the guys in your league, guys and girls in your league are. There are people, we've talked about it before here on the fly, very petty people in fantasy football that when they are burned by a player, they will not draft that player again. Deebo Samuel is one of those guys, I think, this year that last year, if you drafted him with one of your top picks, he kind of burned you a little bit. Those kind of managers might not want him again this year. They look at Brandon Ayuk, they see Christian McCaffrey there, George Kittle. It's a crowded house in San Francisco. Quarterback issues. It's probably Brock Purdy, but again, coming off of major elbow injury. But when you look at last season, Brandon Ayuk had his best season of his career last year. That's great. I love Brandon Ayuk. He's in a contract year. But that took away a little bit from Deebo Samuel. In just 13 games, though, Deebo Samuel had 8.3 touches per game, just 0.2 touches less than he did in his breakout 2021 season when he was running the ball a lot, etc. Obviously, now they have Christian McCaffrey. He is the biggest threat to Deebo Samuel, in my opinion, because he loses those carries out of the backfield. But I think the outlier here is the 14 touchdowns in 2021 versus the 5 last year for Deebo in 2022. I do think we see a little bit more middle ground with consistency at the quarterback position. Hopefully, we see Brock Purdy out there. But in the last 3 seasons, Deebo Samuel has caught passes from 5 different starting quarterbacks. If we can get a guy under center like Brock Purdy, who threw no less than 2 touchdowns per start last year, he averaged, I think, 2.5 touchdowns per game through the air. I think we're going to see a better season out of Deebo Samuel this year. And I think he can, he'll be drafted 4th, 5th round. He can play to the caliber of a 2nd, 3rd round pick on a very good offense this year. He's a guy that I'm not passing up because I don't feel burned by him based on last year. I just think his stock was way too high, way too inflated, and people fell for it a little bit. It happens, but I don't think we're also going to get a 2021 Deebo season, but it's there. He is a yards after the catch monster. He is a great playmaker when the ball is in his hands. I have no problem if I'm drafting him as a wide receiver 2, but you can get him at a wide receiver 3 price.
Yeah, the thing with Deebo, I think, too, is you look at some of the other players on the team, and I think there's more appeal with how they're utilized in PPR formats as well. Ayuk is kind of viewed as more of the PPR guy compared to Deebo, who's more friendly because of the amount of carries that he gets in standard leagues. Same with George Kittle as well. I think a lot of people think that George Kittle as a tight end has more value in PPR compared to other tight ends. If you were to place them one next to another in standard leagues. And so I think some of that, it's kind of detracts away from Deebo in people's eyes. But, when he was at that career year that he had back in 2021, it didn't matter PPR versus standard for Deebo. Deebo was a stud in both of those formats. So I think that it's utilization that has people fearful of Deebo potentially not bouncing back to the extent that he was in 2021. I think it's certainly possible. You could be getting, you mentioned rounds 4 and 5, a wide receiver 1 if his utilization just kind of goes back to where it was before. And a lot of that, like you said, it can be attributed to who's throwing him the ball. The fact that it's been a carousel of quarterbacks these last few years, and Trey Lance hasn't had a great start to camp so far, and I kind of felt like going in with where he was selected and the fact that he was going to be healthy at the start of camp while Purdy was not, that it was kind of Trey Lance's job to lose. If Lance performed well, Lance was going to keep the job because of where he was selected. But if he doesn't take the job, if you will, if he starts to slip, then Purdy's going to be there waiting in the wings for it to be handed back to him. So I think you're right. I think whether it's week 1 or week 3 or 4 in the season, Brock Purdy will be back, and hard pressed outside of an injury to see him losing a job over the course of the season. So there'll be a little more consistency for Debo and company this year, I think.
Yeah, it really just comes down to, again, when the ball is in his hands, I think he is one of the most electric players in the NFL, and it's a proven fact that he is. I mean, I mentioned the yards after the catch. Debo Samuel, again, to harp on that number, 8.3 touches per game last year. If you're telling me Debo Samuel is even getting 7 touches per game, I'm all in, because he can do some special things when it's in his hand. Let's go back to your list here. Who's another player that you can't stop drafting ahead of the 2023 season?
We touched on him a little bit in this last one, so I'll keep it with wide receivers and bring him up again so we can turn our attention to him. It's the wide receiver opposite Debo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk. I mean, I like him as a big sleeper. You kind of made the case for it a little bit. He's in a contract year. And it seems like the last 2 years, Ayuk has just been on the cusp of a big season. And he just needs to get the ball more consistently for that to happen. Like, I love him in best ball leagues. The consistency in terms of targets hasn't been there. Was at its best last year. And you mentioned that in PPR leagues, he was wide receiver 25. We're talking a low-end wide receiver 2, a high-end wide receiver 3 that is sometimes available all the way down in rounds 6 and 7 from what I've seen in standard leagues. I like him more in PPR, kind of like I laid out before, than I do Debo. Not necessarily head-to-head, but I think Ayuk kind of gains value in a PPR format, while Debo does lose a bit of value in a PPR format. But I think Ayuk, the floor after last year is higher on him than it has been in years past. But the ceiling, I think he's got potential low-end wide receiver 1 ceiling. Like I said, if those targets can start appearing consistently week in and week out for Ayuk, where he doesn't become a matchup play, he now becomes, okay, I don't care who he's matched up against. I'm playing him every single week. He's my guy.
Yeah, I mentioned already before that he had a career best year last year, and I don't want that to take away that he's all of a sudden going to fall off a cliff. I actually think you're right. I think his floor is higher this year. I already mentioned Debo Samuel, wide receiver 24 on a points per game basis last year in just 13 games. Probably played into why Ayuk had such a great year. He played all 17 games, but Brandon Ayuk, wide receiver 25 on a points per game basis. They were neck and neck as far as scoring. So I think you're right. His first 1,000-yard season last year, he saw over 100 targets for the first time, career high 8 touchdowns. Let's not talk about the elephant in the room here. Christian McCaffrey, Debo Samuel do miss time quite often. We've seen it before. It's fathomable that both of those guys miss time again in 2023, and Ayuk is the guy in San Francisco. So I like his value right now as well. We hope everybody obviously stays healthy, but we do have to take those things into consideration just a little bit. But I do hope this is another career year for Brandon Ayuk, and I wonder if they will re-sign him, because it would be interesting to see what that kind of production does to his free agency value next offseason. I'm going to pivot here back to my list and talk about another guy that I've been, drafting a lot of, and that is Damian Harris, Buffalo Bills running back. I've been getting him really late, and that's why I want to talk about him here. All of the reports out of Buffalo's camp right now are that James Cook is ready for a RB1 role, which I do believe. But Damian Harris cannot be ignored. First of all, let's not forget to mention that Nyheim Hines was just on a jet ski this offseason, I think a week or two ago. And unfortunately, someone else on a jet ski ran into him, tearing his ACL. He is done for the season. So when you look at the Bills' backfield, it's Cook and it's Damian Harris. And that's really the only guys of note. Obviously, as well, Josh Allen is going to be running. But having Nyheim Hines out of the mix does boost James Cook's stock a lot as a pass catcher, which I do think we're going to see a lot of. But What I want to talk about with Damian Harris here is the red zone rushing. Josh Allen last year led the Bills in carries from the 10-yard line and in. He had 33% of the Bills' red zone attempts last year. Devin Singletary had 44.5% of the Bills' red zone rushing attempts last year. He gone. He is not there anymore. Replaced seemingly by, I would say, James Cook. I think James Cook is going to see a lot of the in between the 20s work from Devin Singletary. But when they get into the red zone, I actually think Damian Harris comes into play. Let's not forget 2 years ago, Damian Harris, 2021, 15 rushing touchdowns for the New England Patriots. 9 of them were inside the 10-yard line. We've heard a lot this offseason. The Bills want to watch how much Josh Allen is running. He's kind of like a battering ram when he gets the ball in his hands and he tries to punch it into the end zone. I think that's why they got Damian Harris. At worst, you're throwing a 12th round or later pick on this guy and hoping you can plug him into your flex and he's going to score a touchdown, which on the Buffalo Bills offense, pretty likely. They're a high-scoring offense. At worst, he's a guy that just sits on your bench and, something happens to James Cook, you have a possibly starting running back on your roster that you spent a really late pick on. So he's a guy that I see as a tremendous value right now later in drafts. Not a lot of touches in his career. He's 26 years old. This is a guy I think that's just kind of gotten forgotten because he was in the mix with New England, injured a little bit last year. Ramondre Stevenson broke out, but going to the Bills, a divisional rival who needs someone to carry the load a little bit, take it off of Josh Allen, I think this guy is a tremendous value right now.
I both love and hate that you included Damian Harris on this list for the same reason. He was going to be on my list. I love that we think alike, but you stole my pick. Hey. I was going to have Damian Harris on my list for the same exact reasons that you laid out. He is available consistently late in drafts. The red zone touches, I think he has a chance to feast, which is going to be a thorn in the side of James Cook draftees when, if the season goes where, Cook gets 4 rushing touchdowns and Harris walks away with 10 at the end of the year. Damian Harris could turn into that touchdown vulture. But one thing I'll say about Damian Harris as well, how you kind of alluded to that he was the forgotten man in New England a little bit. Let's face it, the Buffalo Bills are playing to win this year. They're not playing to develop anybody. If James Cook is not getting the job done, Damian Harris can steal that job. And I view Damian Harris as one of the last available running back selections you can get in a draft that can win the starting running back job without an injury. I think he's one of the final guys that you can select that you can, by week 5 or 6, all of a sudden he's getting 15, 16 carries a game. And now you've got a guy that's a consistent starter that you're drafting amongst backups. So I that's where I view Damian Harris as someone that I keep finding myself taking again and again and again. It's just because I look at him and I look at what else is available and it's okay, maybe I take this guy, but he's not going to really see any time unless this guy ahead of him gets hurt. Damian Harris is the last one that's got that RB2 upside where you can play him on a consistent basis without, like I said, without requiring anyone in front of them to go down for an extended period of time with an injury. I think Harris is one of the best steals in drafts from when we started this about 5 weeks ago, our mock draft series, to now.
Yeah, I mean, when you're heading into Sunday night football, Monday night football, as the Bills often play, I don't have their schedule in front of me, but if you're looking at your guys on your bench and you're like, I just need someone in my flex that's going to score a touchdown this week. Damian Harris. I was just looking as you were going on there about James Cook and his snap count percentage as well. In active games last year, he only played in 25% of the Buffalo Bills offensive snaps. So all of a sudden to have this RB1 season, RB1 workload is asking a lot out of the second-year player. Damian Harris is a guy that has done it before. I don't think we're going to see James Cook all of a sudden see 70% or more of the running back snaps in Buffalo, but maybe in the 60s. But you might see Damian Harris see about 40%, maybe even closer to 50. So think maybe like even Pollard, Zeke. This could be that kind of balance there in Buffalo. All right, let's head back to your list here. How about a running back? I just did one. How about you got one there on your list?
Yeah, I've got one. And I think part of the reason why he's available late is just the veil of uncertainty over his status in the beginning of the season. And it's Alvin Kamara. He just met earlier today at the time of this recording with Roger Goodell, the commissioner. Sounds like he's going to be suspended. How long he will be suspended, I'm not sure. But this is, again, another guy that I think late in the draft has the upside to find himself in a starting position. I'm getting him usually about rounds 8 or 9, usually just past the flex spot. Maybe it took a third wide receiver and he's going to be your third running back. Or if you've got running back aggressive, he's your fourth running back. But I view him as, again, someone that's got that RB1 upside. The last 2 years weren't that vintage Alvin Kamara. He wasn't that, one of the best running backs in football like we saw early in his career. But the offense should be better this season for New Orleans. They've got a big upgrade at quarterback, Derek Carr coming to town. Michael Thomas is healthy. We'll see if it remains that way, but just adding a weapon like him back into the offense, even if only for a little while, certainly helps. But I think the reason he's being taken so late is, again, we don't know if he's facing a 2-game suspension or if he's facing a 6-game suspension. And we'll see how his draft value moves after the suspension is announced. Let's say it's a short 2-game suspension. Are you confident that the running backs that you draft ahead of him, and whomever you draft to play in that flex spot, you can survive 2 weeks with that roster, with him unavailable, a hole burned into one spot on your bench? I think most people would be confident in their drafting abilities to say, yes, I can get by with the players I draft to be my starters for 2 weeks, for 3, for 4 weeks. Now, if it does start to get to 6 weeks, then maybe we see him fall quite a bit further. But if it's a short 2 or 3 week suspension, I kind of see him moving up. But after having a bit of a down year the last 2 years, I don't see it rocketing straight up. But I think he'll still find himself in a spot where he's being underdrafted. And you could find yourself a running back that maybe is a low-end RB2. There's nothing great about him. He's not a league winner, but someone that you can kind of rotate into your flex spot or one of your running back spots, depending on who he's matched up against this season. So that's where I have Alvin Kamara on my list. About rounds 8 or 9, you're getting a sometimes starter guy that has the upside of potentially returning to his old form. I think that's a money pick right there late in drafts.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the suspension because that is really it for Alvin Kamara. We all know what kind of player he is. He's been in the league 6-7 years now, almost 28 years old. I think he actually turns 28 soon, if he didn't already this offseason. But again, it's going to really matter about how many games he gets suspended. And since he met with Goodell today and the report came out, he expects to be, hopefully you have some clarity in the next week. And this is why we really want to do our redraft league drafts later on. I know in person, sometimes they have to be moved up a bit. I know I have one on the 18th. That's most teams' preseason game 2 week. So gets a little hinky there. You have a lot of camp left before the season starts, but obviously in-person drafts hold more value. You get to hang with your buddies. But if Kamara suspended 6 games, like you may have, we have no idea. Mm-hmm. I didn't expect Deshaun Watson to be suspended 11. I thought maybe that was a full season. So Alvin Kamara pleading down from a felony to a misdemeanor, not to get into that too much, but hopefully works in his favor. If he is suspended 6 games, I always look at the bye week. And the Saints, I believe, have a week 11 bye. So if he's suspended 6 games and has that bye week, that's 7 games you don't have Alvin Kamara. Fantasy football regular season is 14 weeks. That's half of your season, assuming you're pushing for the playoffs, obviously, that you're not going to have Alvin Kamara. So that makes him a lot riskier in my mind. Not that big of a deal, though, if it's 2 games. Like you said, I think you could find plenty of running backs, Damian Harris, that you can draft later on and plug in the first 2 weeks. But Alvin Kamara is a special talent. I do think the Saints are going to improve offensively, obviously with Derek Carr under center. The only thing that makes me a little nervous about Alvin Kamara, and I love where he's going. You mentioned 8th, 9th round. If you go wide receiver heavy early, even get Travis Kelce early, and you get Alvin Kamara in the 8th or 9th round that you can stash for a little bit, could be a league-winning move. And you can win your leagues in the draft for sure. But the only thing that makes me a little nervous is that they have Jamal Williams, who they signed in free agency, 17 rushing touchdowns last year for the Detroit Lions. And they drafted Kendre Miller, 17 touchdowns last year for TCU. 2 very, very good backs, big bruisers, could affect Alvin Kamara in the red zone, which we've seen a little bit of a decline in his usage over the last couple seasons. He's great in the middle of the field, great for PPR leagues, but I just wonder this is maybe his biggest threat to touches ever in his career. We've seen him play with Mark Ingram. They were both successful, but having both Jamal Williams and perhaps Kendre Miller mixing in makes me a little nervous that he's part of a three-headed monster there. Perhaps the largest head, but three-headed nonetheless.
I'll say this about Kamara with one final point. You mentioned the touchdowns, and they're definitely down from the last 2 years compared to the year prior to that when he had 16. But most of his work comes in the fact that he gets those hidden receiving yards as a running back. That's the appeal with him. I think you're right in terms of where he is. His ceiling is not that top 5 RB running back season. I don't think Alvin Kamara in any realm is going to finish as one of the 5 best running backs in football. I think those days, especially with the competition around him, are gone. But I will say this about Alvin Kamara and the competition he's got. This is the biggest competition around him that he's had. You have to go back to his rookie year when Adrian Peterson actually began the season on the New Orleans Saints, lost his job to Alvin Kamara as a rookie. And that's probably the only time Kamara's really had some competition anywhere near what he's got right now.
Yeah, and I think he had 81 receptions his rookie season, which is like top 7 all time for a rookie running back. So we knew right away how special Alvin Kamara was, and he's kept that up. I think he had 81 receptions for like 3 straight years on the money. Mm-hmm. So if he can get back to that.
81, 83 his 4th year, and it's dipped down below 60 each of the last 2 years.
Well, no Drew Brees, and he's been replaced by Jameis Winston, Andy Dalton, Taysom Hill for a couple plays here and there, which makes me very annoyed. But
Chris Olave coming to town doesn't help.
Exactly. And again, Michael Thomas, injured, banged up still, hopefully will be back this year. But if you have Chris Olave and Michael Thomas on that offense and Rashid Shaheed, all three available, an improved tight end group, might be a little bit of a threat to Alvin Kamara's receiving upside that we've come to know and love over the years.
And Jimmy Graham back in town as well. You said you didn't have that on your bingo card. I had to read that tweet about 5 times to make sure it said, yes, 1 year deal, not a 1 day deal where they sign it and then retire.
And I heard, and I'll put it in air quotes because this is what I read on Twitter, or X now, as we call it. It's still Twitter to me, but he is that dude in training camp, which, again, they've got Juwan Johnson, they've got Foster Moreau, now Jimmy Graham at tight end. Downgrades them all for me, honestly, a little bit. Even if Jimmy Graham isn't the guy there or that dude, he does ding the value of the other two a little bit, so that hurts. Let's stay in the NFC South and go back to my list here. This is a guy that I've had in 3 straight mock drafts, mock draft 3, 4, and 5. I've been getting him in the 5th, 6th round. That's Miles Sanders. I am a Philadelphia Eagles fan. As you can see, we got the Kelly Green back. But Miles Sanders is now in the Carolina Panthers, and I'm still such a big fan of him. 2022 career season for Miles Sanders, 279 touches in 17 games. We love to see him play a full season. 16.4 touches per game, also a great number, RB1 number, for a team. But obviously battling Jalen Hurts for touches out of the backfield, as well as Boston Scott and Kenny Gainwell. 11 rushing touchdowns after having 0 the year prior, which was great to see. And he had 9 total touchdowns from 2018 to 2021, which is just incredible that all of a sudden he crushed that number in 1 season alone. Miles Sanders on the Eagles, they threw the ball at the lowest rate to the running backs last year, so he was not effective in a PPR league. So when you go and look at his ranking from last year, he's nowhere near the top. He scored 11 touchdowns, but the receiving upside is just not there for him on the Philadelphia Eagles. However, I think on the Carolina Panthers, he can get back to that. Rookie quarterback in Carolina, Bryce Young, I think he's going to see 50 or 60 targets, honestly, in Carolina. You look at their receiving options right now, Adam Thielen, 33 years old, Hayden Hurst at tight end. I mean, the fact that I even mentioned the tight end as the second target should say something. Terrace Marshall Jr., we don't know where he's at. Laviska Shenault, gadget players. So I think Miles Sanders is going to be a focal point in this offense, 3 down back. Again, with a rookie quarterback, I think he's going to get the ball a ton, a lot of handoffs, going to be on the field a lot. His competition in the backfield, Raheem Blackshear, Chuba Hubbard, really non-existent as far as, a threat to his touches. So again, we've talked strategy a little bit here on the fly. If you go wide receiver heavy early on, maybe even grab Travis Kelce or get your quarterback early, and you really like make your roster top heavy, and you're like, man, I need a running back. Miles Sanders starts that tier for me of guys that you can plug in as your running back one, maybe not drafted as such, but can perform as such in 2023. And even if they're not a running back one in the rankings by the end of the season and they're hovering from 12 to 20, hopefully you've drafted your receivers ahead of him well enough that they're the ones really, as the engine to your fantasy team. So I like Miles Sanders in that role, but I think he's going to surprise people a lot this year. I think we're going to see him worked in as a receiver a little bit more. He's back with Deuce Staley, who he's very familiar with from his days in Philadelphia. So this is a guy, 5th, 6th round, I'm not passing up. I'm taking him over guys like Dameon Pierce. Same amount of touches, perhaps, in Houston. Rookie quarterback there, but not a ton of receiving upside. Rachaad White maybe has more receiving upside than both of those guys, but how good is that Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense going to be? I just don't know. And he has a little bit more competition for touches down there. So Miles Sanders to me is a guy that is he's one of my favorite targets in that 5th, 6th round. I find myself, depending on how the first 5 picks have gone, targeting him in that middle round there.
I think he's a good target if you execute a 0 RB strategy because of the upside that's there. And especially if you're an aggressive drafter. My only fear with him is the team that he finds himself on. You laid it out with the targets that are there. None of them are appealing, which can be a double-edged sword. Yeah, no one's going to be really throwing the ball around a lot, but defenses know that. And so they're going to be loading the box up against Carolina a lot and kind of basically saying, all right, Bryce Young, let's see if you can beat us through the air. Let's go, pick number 101. And with that as well, I don't think anyone's expecting the Panthers to be a quick turnaround type team. So they're going to be trailing late in a lot of games this year, I think, is the expectation out of Carolina, which then they're going to be forced to pass the ball quite a bit. So Miles Sanders, I see as a high upside, but not high risk. That's a little bit of a stretch to call it. But I could easily see him falling out of the RB2 category and be like a high-end RB3 flex type player. I just think that the situation he's in can really make things bad for him and the opportunity in front of him. Versus, I mean, I think if DJ Moore was there, it entirely changes the conversation for me.
Sure.
I think that's it, that there's no one wide receiver or target in the passing game that you look at and have to respect. I don't really see that out of Carolina. So the way I see it is it's going to be a lot of teams basically saying, okay, we respect Miles Sanders. We're going to load the box against him. Bryce Young, let's see if you can beat me.
Yeah, and I didn't mention, I was just looking at their roster there. DJ Shark, another receiver that they got, but really more of a deep threat. So how long can Bryce Young really sit in the pocket before DJ Shark is even open? I'm not really sure. So again, like you said, lackluster receiving group. You might be right there. I'm just hoping that this is a year that we see Miles Sanders find some balance in his scoring as perhaps a target out of the backfield. And I think he can be. But I really like the value right now. He's really not expensive. And I think the ceiling is there. It's just a matter of, he scored 11 touchdowns last year. We'll even get half of those this year. I don't know. You might be right.
Do want to remind you, I'll interject here for a second,
Yeah.
to set up the league in Fantrax this year. It's great for, especially if you're listening to us right now, customizing your leagues. I was just setting up one of our leagues to move over to Fantrax this year. And man, some of the things you can customize, you can duplicate players if you want. That's how ridiculous the customization is. You can set up your playoffs to have custom matchups. So if you want to have some other external factor in there, one thing I've suggested for our punishment league the last couple of years, but we haven't pulled off because there's no way to really do it, is make it a free for all. And so we can kind of customize that where, the first 2 weeks are normal. And then the final one with the custom consolation bracket, we can take someone out and place them into the loser's bowl. So you got all sorts of customization options. Great if you're in dynasty leagues as well. You can set dollar amounts for specific players to make sure that people aren't going over on salary cap. Any little intricate rules you want to add for redraft leagues, those are available as well. I know the round reversal is one that's popular with the Scott Fishbowl. Round reversal is an option too. So lots of fun little intricate things you can do with Fantrax. Obviously, that's who we're here for. The Fly, powered by Fantrax. So definitely consider switching your league to Fantrax this year.
Yeah, one thing I really like about Fantrax as well, for all the commissioners out there, and it's time to start thinking about this, is if you play in a league with money and you need people to pay up and put in their dues, Fantrax has a treasurer option that
Hmm.
guarantees that everyone pays before draft day. So it's August 2nd now. Switch your league over there, set that up, and guarantee that the pot will be full by the time everyone's making their picks.
And you can set the payout as well, so that way you don't have to worry about anyone in the league kind of, hounding you about not paying them
Right.
within 5 seconds of the clock hitting zero on Sunday Night Football in week 17 or 18, depending on when you have your season end. That money will be on its way to them. It makes your job as a commissioner easy.
Absolutely. All right, let's head back over to your list here for one of the fourth of five players we're talking about here that you cannot stop drafting. Who is it? Who do you want to talk about?
This is going to be my pound the table guy because it's still mind blowing to me that now we know where he's playing and he's still being drafted where he is. Why is nobody taking DeAndre Hopkins as a potential wide receiver one? That's what he is. When he's healthy, he's a wide receiver one. I don't think he's going to finish as the overall wide receiver one. I'd be mind blown if he outperforms Justin Jefferson. But I don't know about you, and maybe it's different in your PPR leagues drafts compared to my standard ones. But I'm finding him as a low end wide receiver two or a flex. That's where I'm getting him in rounds 4, 5, and 6. It blows my mind that you can wait and get a wide receiver like DeAndre Hopkins. Yes, he's on the Tennessee Titans, and that isn't, the most appealing offense for wide receivers in passing. And I know the whole meme about this is where wide receiver careers go to die. Listen, DeAndre Hopkins is not at the tail end of his career like some of those other wide receivers in that meme were. DeAndre Hopkins is still in his prime. If you watched any DeAndre Hopkins from last year, you saw exactly how good he is. I don't see any serious competition for targets out there. I know there's competition for touches with Derrick Henry, but DeAndre Hopkins, Ryan Tannehill is not an awful quarterback. He's not the great quarterback. I don't think he ever was a great quarterback. I think he's always been good, but I still think he's on that good level. Like a few spots below a Kirk Cousins, if you will. And Kirk Cousins is throwing to the consensus wide receiver one, Justin Jefferson, this year. No one's really knocking Justin Jefferson because he works with Kirk Cousins. No one knocked Justin Jefferson because Dalvin Cook was on the team. Why aren't we giving the same treatment to DeAndre Hopkins? I should not be finding him as late in drafts as I am. And if you're drafting and you're finding DeAndre Hopkins where you are, that's going to be one of those picks when the rosters are all settled and the draft is done and everyone's looking at the board and kind of tilting their head of, how did you get DeAndre Hopkins there? How did that happen? So I don't know if you're seeing the same thing in your PPR. Maybe it's different in PPR because of the amount of targets he'll get with the Tennessee Titans that he's expected to see. But it blows my mind where I'm finding him available in standard leagues.
Yeah, I've definitely drafted him on some of my mock drafts on fantraxhq.com and PPR leagues. And I think when I set up my rosters, he's sliding in as my wide receiver 3, which is just ridiculous. I actually tweeted this out. You read my mind. On July 24th, I tweeted this out. Randy Moss was 33 years old and played 8 games.
Mm-hmm.
Andre Johnson was 35 and played 8 games. Julio Jones was 33 and played 10 games. And Robert Woods was 30, but 10 months post ACL.
Mm-hmm.
Why are we comparing DeAndre Hopkins to those guys? It's very easy to get sucked into the narratives in fantasy football in general. So DeAndre Hopkins puts on a Tennessee Titans uniform and his career's over. I'm just not there yet. You look at last year, obviously drafting him was risky business as well. He was coming off of a suspension. Obviously his season ended the year prior due to an injury, which then led to that suspension on his comeback with the PEDs. But he came back for 9 games and he drew 96 targets in 9 games. Absolutely ridiculous numbers. So yeah, I understand that the Tennessee Titans like to run the ball. I understand that they have Derrick Henry. I understand that this is probably the last season Derrick Henry is going to play for the Tennessee Titans, but he is nearing 30 years old. They have the worst O-line in football, arguably, but the fact that, it's a discussion should say something. I think they're going to throw the ball a ton. And Treylon Burks is pretty good. I'm not going to say Treylon Burks is this elite receiver opposite of DeAndre Hopkins, but he could be. He's only in his second season. Treylon Burks and Robert Woods is not the same as Treylon Burks and DeAndre Hopkins. I think DeAndre Hopkins is going to see a lot of single coverage because defenses have to be honest with Derrick Henry, the threat of Derrick Henry. I think we could see another DeAndre Hopkins season where he's at least seeing 8 targets a game, if not more. So that sort of volume to me, if you slide that in, like I said, as your wide receiver 3 on a PPR league, I mean, even in a non-PPR, it doesn't even matter. I think you're getting the wide receiver 1 on an offense. And I think that's really important. I know it's not the pass heaviest offense, but we might see a little bit more balance in 2023. So, yeah, I'll pound the table right there with you. I think the disrespect just because he's wearing a Titans uniform has gone too far, and that's really it for some people. I haven't heard a legitimate argument otherwise as to him slowing down or DeAndre Hopkins is cooked or this and that. Those guys I mentioned before, Andre Johnson, Julio Jones, even Randy Moss at his point in his career, I'm not going to say they were cooked, but they were seriously on the decline. We haven't seen that yet from DeAndre Hopkins.
Their prime, I think,
Absolutely.
is the best way to describe it. And DeAndre Hopkins is still in his prime.
He said he would step away from the game when he's not, I think he said a 1,200-yard receiver. So if he didn't step away yet, I don't think he's the kind of guy that wants to step away or play until the point where people are saying he's washed. So I think this is going to be a really good season for him. Again, if you leave your drafts and he's your wide receiver 1, I'd be a little bit nervous about that, but you don't have to draft him as your wide receiver 1. You can draft him as your wide receiver 2 at most. But like you said, getting him as wide receiver 3 sometimes as a flex option. It's absolutely ridiculous. I do wonder if, a couple more camp videos come out, people change their mind. But DeAndre Hopkins has been in the league for so long that I think people are turning their attention towards the new and exciting and young receivers. So I know I have him as a top 20 receiver. I ranked him pretty conservatively. I'm not going to just put him in my top 12 because there are young and new and exciting receivers that I feel stronger about. But if he finished inside the top 12, would you be shocked?
I wouldn't. No. I actually had him as my wide receiver 10. I went as high as putting him inside the top 10.
There you go.
I'll say this, the two, you mentioned what might wake people up. I think the only thing besides camp videos that could wake people up is if he just has one ridiculous catch in a preseason game where he just snatches the ball away from, typical DeAndre Hopkins, just winning the high point battle. If he does that and just kind of reminds everyone, I'm still that dude, then I think everyone, okay, I remember DeAndre Hopkins now. I remember that guy was pretty good. And I'll say this is the only other thing I could think of why his stock is so low right now is it's almost an overcorrection from what a lot of people wanted to see happen. We all, unless you're, rooting for an opposing team, I think everyone wanted to see DeAndre Hopkins end up on the Kansas City Chiefs. Like, Patrick Mahomes, Patrick Mahomes throwing to DeAndre Hopkins. Outside of him falling to your favorite team, unless you're a rival of the Chiefs, I think everyone pretty much wanted to see DeAndre Hopkins as a part of the Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes show. But that didn't happen. And I wonder if this is almost an overcorrection to that of, everyone was so excited about the potential that could have been. And now that he's not there and that he's on a run-heavy offense instead, it's, oh, man, he's going to be terrible this year. So I almost wonder if that might have something to do with it.
Yeah, I mean, I almost, in some sort of multiverse, want to know how people would feel if he ended up on, like, the New England Patriots. Because do you feel better about Mac Jones and Ryan Tannehill? Alongside of a guy like Juju Smith-Schuster, Ramondre Stevenson, guys that can catch passes? I actually think this is a better landing spot than some of the alternatives out there.
I don't know if there was a bad landing spot for him. I laid this out in my first article for Fantrax. Exactly. Because of the talent that DeAndre Hopkins has, unless he signs with a team like, the Bengals or the Vikings, where there is a clear wide receiver next to him that is superior, not just a little bit better, superior to him. I don't really see a bad situation. And those are unrealistic. Those two teams are not going to go get DeAndre Hopkins.
Yeah, it almost reminds me of when Antonio Brown joined the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Rob Gronkowski. Antonio Brown played very well for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but everyone kind of leveled out there. There was no clear, this is the guy. So you see DeAndre Hopkins end up on someone like the Bengals, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd. Like, it all kind of evens itself out ever so slightly. But Yeah, I don't think the landing spot is as bad as everyone makes it seem. So again, episode of Here on the Fly, players we can't stop drafting. I'm going to continue to draft DeAndre Hopkins at his current ADP. Presumed wide receiver one for the Tennessee Titans. Let's turn our attention to the presumed running back one for the Chicago Bears. A guy I can't stop drafting, not high even, and that's really why he made my list, is Khalil Herbert. There are 240 running back touches from last season up for grabs. Not much has changed in Chicago other than the fact that obviously they added a wide receiver one in DJ Moore. But the running back turnover has been immense. I mean, they drafted Roschon Johnson. They signed Dante Foreman in free agency. Justin Fields, very run-heavy quarterback there. But Khalil Herbert is still there. The lead back in 2022, David Montgomery, is now in Detroit with the Lions. He was the RB 26 last year. I'm getting Khalil Herbert in like the 13th, 14th round in some of my drafts. I guess Justin Fields' running tendencies has suppressed his ADP a little bit, but 11.7 points per game for David Montgomery last year, 65% of the snaps and games that he was active last year, to Herbert's 38% last year. I would have to imagine Khalil Herbert, being the back in the system, is going to see the most of David Montgomery's, at least for the beginning of the season. David Montgomery also 20th in red zone rush attempts. I can't imagine they want to continue to see Justin Fields run the ball as much as he did. I mean, he had 1,100 rushing yards last year, 160 rush attempts. That number has to come down simply because they're going to pass more. But Khalil Herbert is a starting running back for an NFL team as of now. And even if he, that dissipates throughout the season, you can get this guy in the 13th round, add him to your roster. Hey, you mentioned before, and just thought of this here on the fly, coincidentally, if you draft Alvin Kamara and you need to wait 4 weeks or so, why not have Khalil Herbert on your roster for a couple weeks just to see if he emerges as the lead back in Chicago? But when we look at depth and we look at upside, Khalil Herbert's it. When he sees double-digit touches, he scores fantasy points. I mean, it's plain and simple here to say, but it's one of those guys that, you don't think these late-round picks matter. Let me take a chance on a rookie. We've seen some rookie picks not pan out. I've seen Deneric Prince, running back for the Kansas City Chiefs, in some people's rankings as this sleeper pick. That reminds me of a guy on the Chiefs a couple years ago. I can't remember his name right now, but I know some people were, hyped up about him running back on the Chiefs. He didn't play like any snaps throughout the season. If you're going to take a late round flyer on a running back, I know rookies are fun. I know they can come on late, but Khalil Herbert is a guy that is ready right now, and you can get in the double-digit rounds. I love it.
I'll say this about people that might be fearful of taking Khalil Herbert because he might lose the job over the course of the season. Remember, when you draft your team, that is not the final build of your team. You are building your team to start the season. And so if you got a couple weeks of starting quality running back from Khalil Herbert, take that. I think that's a great pick if you execute the zero RB strategy, where you need someone that you can rely upon out of the gates. That could be a potential, flex or running back two if you do take, like you mentioned, Alvin Kamara, another guy who's a great zero RB strategy guy that's got some upside late. Dalvin Cook still unsigned as of this moment. I know there's some wonders whether or not he too is going to be suspended at the beginning of the year. Khalil Herbert's great suspension insurance policy, basically. And if you really are that nervous about him losing the job to Roschon Johnson over the course of the season, use your final pick on Roschon Johnson. It's essentially the handcuff to Khalil Herbert with the upside that he could potentially steal that job. So I see no problem taking Khalil Herbert, even if you are fearful of him losing the job. First of all, he might not lose the job. He might play up to the talent that we've seen from him at various points in the last 2 years. And so what do you have to lose? Worst case scenario, you got a starting quality running back for a few weeks. You cut him when you find someone that looks great on waivers after week 5 or 6.
Yeah, like I said, it's very easy to get distracted, especially if you're in an in-person draft and the adult beverages are flowing later in those rounds. But this is a name you need to remember for the 12th, 13th, 14th round. Those picks matter. All right, let's wrap up your list here. Who is one last player you find yourself drafting a ton of so far in your Fantrax mock drafts?
I, as the Giants fan on the podcast, will try to contain my fanhood too much.
I didn't pick any Eagles, by the way.
You picked a former Eagle, though, in Sanders. Technically, he hasn't played a snap for the Giants yet, so it's a future Giant, if you will. But Darren Waller, I'm surprised amongst the tight ends that I'm consistently finding him as one of the last tight ends available. But he has just been cooking every single person, the Giants defense and Wink Martindale, just try to have stick within the realm of Darren Waller in camp. I mean, he blew past Deonte Banks, who's the speedy corner that's the rookie. He's been beaten on the safeties and the linebackers. He's just looked unguardable. Now, I understand that he has the recent injury history, and that will be the big question for Darren Waller this year is, can Darren Waller stay healthy? But with what I've seen so far and the amount of work that he's getting in the team drills as well, it's to the extent where they're having to specifically pull him out so that the Giants and Daniel Jones can throw the ball to somebody else to force the offense to look to another part of the field as opposed to the seam with Darren Waller. This is a guy that could put up just insane tight end numbers that I don't want to go as far as Travis Kelce, but might be the bridge between Travis Kelce and the rest of the fantasy football tight ends if he stays healthy. And
yeah, I think that's the big
only
fear.
Yeah, that I really truly believe at this point with the amount of work that he's going to get, how healthy and how athletic he's looked so far for the Giants through their camp. And I know it's been about a week. We are 48 hours into the Giants having padded practices. But it really seems like, the injury report could be the only thing to keep Darren Waller from finishing as a tight end 2 or tight end 3 in fantasy this season. I don't want to say tight end 1, but if you told me that Darren Waller is going to play all 17 games this season and that he finished as a tight end 1, I'd probably be only 40% shocked.
Yeah, I do a bold prediction series on fantraxhq.com. I did a bold prediction, which I know some people aren't very into hot takes, but they're pretty educated guesses, I think, this year. One for each team. I wrote them over the last month and a half or so, and I'm pretty sure, I'd have to go back and check, but I'm almost positive. Maybe I just feel this way. I'm pretty sure my Giants one was that Darren Waller will finish as the tight end 1. Again, going to be tough to beat Kelce. It's been done before by Mark Andrews, but I think he can finish as 2 or 3. And right now you're getting him at 5, 6, sometimes even 7, depending on who you're drafting up against. I know some people really like David Njoku. The Kyle Pitts hive is still alive and buzzing. Pat Freiermuth, Evan Ingram, who I'll talk about here in a second, actually. So
and those last 2 you mentioned, if you're in a 10-team league, you can sometimes get those guys outside of the top 10. Dalton Schultz is a third name I'll throw in. If you are truly worried about the injury bug with Darren Waller, just get yourself an insurance policy. Be the first person to draft a backup tight end, even if you do have to do it a couple rounds earlier than you thought you might have to. Even if you take a backup tight end before that one person who's going to wait till one of the last rounds to take a tight end takes his starting tight end, just take a ticket on an insurance policy. Best case scenario for him is Darren Waller does get hurt, and now you've got a starting quality tight end available to you. The worst case scenario is you wasted, a 9th, 10th round pick late, but not super late in the draft where you can maybe take a sleeper, and you don't wind up trading him for anything big over the course of the season. But that's what insurance policy is there for. It's there when you need it. And for a tight end with the upside of Darren Waller, you can really increase your floor, not his individual floor, but the floor of scoring from the position if you take a guy like your final selection in Darren Waller.
Yeah, I just think that there's so much turnover at the back end of these tight end 1 rankings by the end of the season. There's so many new names that emerge each year. And there's a lot of guys with upside this year that I really like. I'm a huge Dalton Kincaid guy. I think people are starting to come around to what I've been talking about for months now since he's been drafted by the Bills. Chiga Okonkwo, Greg Dulcich, who sees a little bit of an uptick based on the Tim Patrick Achilles tear of yesterday. So again, like you said, there's different levels of insurance. It's not always going to be premium insurance where you get a guy like Evan Ingram or something. Maybe you have to settle for the lesser insurance company. You get what you pay for. You use a 14th round pick on your second tight end behind Waller. It's not going to be as good as if you use the 9th, 10th round pick, but someone I would take an insurance policy out for. You could even take Bellinger, his back,
Yeah.
or is it? Yeah, his backup.
Yep.
And the guy looks swole. He looks great. If Darren Waller goes down, I have to imagine they're still going to plug in a tight end.
Daniel Bolkinger with the way that he worked
Yeah,
out this
exactly.
offseason. I'll say this about Bellinger. I don't think I'd be taking him in regular
No.
standard leagues. I mean, if you want to handcuff him, that's great. But for those of you in deeper leagues, I think Bellinger is still going to see a pretty solid snap count for the Giants this year because Darren Waller can split out and the Giants don't have an elite X receiver. Even a lot of their better receivers are more of slot receivers. Sterling Shepard, Wan'Dale Robinson when he comes back. Paris Campbell's looked good through camp so far. He's a new addition to the Giants. Isaiah Hodgins. I think a lot of those guys, because they play in the slot, open up the outside for Darren Waller. But because the Giants have Saquon Barkley and can be so run heavy, Bellinger still, I could see finishing, playing like 80% of snaps over the course of the season, give or take a little bit, just because, their 12 personnel can still include Darren Waller split out wide. You got Saquon in the backfield, and technically 2 tight ends are out there, but only 1 is lined up. So I expect to see a lot of 12 personnel from the Giants this year.
I had to remind myself, so I just looked it up real quick. But Darren Waller, it feels like he's like 33, 34. He's been around for a while, banged up. He's only 30 years old.
Yeah.
Turning 31 in September. So obviously this season will be his age 31 year season. But
throw this in there as well, contract year for him. The Giants, when they traded him, a lot of people were wondering, is this just to move some money? Because not a single dollar on his contract this year was guaranteed. But now he's playing for that next contract. If he wants to get one last big contract before the twilight of his career comes around, he needs to have a big, healthy year this year.
Yeah, actually, on one of my mock draft teams, now that I think about it, we talk about insurance policy. I actually doubled up on tight end. If your league allows a flex at tight end, I see Darren Waller as that X receiver at times. I drafted TJ Hawkinson, very pass heavy Minnesota Vikings offense, and I spent a high pick on Darren Waller. So I have a tight end and a flex tight end there on the league. I just wanted to see how it looked. I'd have to go back and look at that whole roster. I didn't hate it. Kind of clogs you up a little bit. You don't really have much flexibility at your flex, ironically, because you don't really want to sit Darren Waller or TJ Hawkinson, but interesting strategy to deploy if your league allows it. I'll wrap up here with the last guy I can't stop drafting, and it's at the tight end position, and he's a former Giant, and he's a guy that we mentioned already. It's Evan Ingram.
Just not an Eagle, but he gave you guys the division that year with that Monday Night Football drop.
That little tip drop. Yeah, I love him for that. But hey, listen, it didn't work out in New York. He went to Jacksonville on a 1-year deal last year, absolutely balled out. They franchise tagged him, and they just gave him a 3-year extension prior to the franchise tag deadline. So he's there for 3 more seasons. I think this can be another career year for Evan Ingram. I know a lot of people are freaked out that Calvin Ridley's there and it's going to take away from somebody. Not so sure. Trevor Lawrence, seventh most pass attempts last year. I don't think he's going to be anything lower than that. I think actually Trevor Lawrence can ascend into top 5 realm, depending on how, maybe Joe Burrow's health is, some other guys up there. But Trevor Lawrence, top 7 in pass attempts last year. Evan Ingram commanded a 17% target share on the Jacksonville Jaguars. Christian Kirk, Zay Jones, and Marvin Jones commanded 58% collectively between the 3 of them. So all of a sudden you have these 4 players, Evan Ingram included, accounting for 75% of the Jacksonville Jaguars targets last year. That's ridiculous. 4 players. I think only 5 total wide receivers were actually targeted by Trevor Lawrence last year. Jamal Agnew being the other one, and I forget who the 5th one is, so irrelevant. But you add Ridley to the mix. I understand now that he's probably the wide receiver 1 for this team, which bumps Zay Jones down, or I'm sorry, Christian Kirk down to wide receiver 2. And I think Zay Jones probably plays the Marvin Jones role, deep threat, 80 or so targets. I still think Evan Ingram's going to get his, though. I think he's going to maintain his value. This is going to be a very good offense again. They have a good run game. They have great receivers, great weapons. They have a good offensive line. When you look at the tight end position and where you're drafting Evan Ingram and who he's up against compared to the offenses they're in, Evan Ingram or Greg Dulcich, I mean, you're asking a lot out of Russell Wilson this year. If you feel good about it, that's fine. I'll take Trevor Lawrence in the Jacksonville Jaguars offense over the Denver Broncos this year. Chigakonkwo, we just talked about DeAndre Hopkins. They have Treylon Burks there. I love Chig as much as the next guy, but when you look at the firepower that the Jacksonville Jaguars offense has, give me their tight end. Pat Fryermuth, it's a little bit of a discussion. David Njoku, it's a little bit of a discussion, but you're getting Evan Ingram after those guys anyway. So Dalton Schultz, I know you mentioned him.
Mm-hmm.
Houston Texans. You really want to go with a rookie quarterback throwing, hopefully, to Dalton Schultz on a one-year deal down there? Maybe. They could be a little bit pass heavier playing from behind, but how successful are they going to be? Evan Ingram as your tight end one, if you decide to punt the position ever so slightly, and you have to wait till that 10th round, maybe 11th if you get lucky, I see no problem with that. I love targeting Evan Ingram, especially if I wait a little bit and my league is targeting the top guys earlier than expected.
I'll say this about Evan Ingram with the addition of
Ridley?
Calvin Ridley, thank you. I was thinking Zay Jones, but I think Zay Jones, more so than anyone, is going to be the big loser in terms of who sees the biggest chunk of their target share disappear. Because he was a nice wide receiver last year in fantasy for the Jaguars. And I think a lot of that just had to do with the volume that he got. And now with Ridley in the mix, I see Zay Jones taking a big step back. I see Kirk taking a little step back. I see Evan Ingram taking a little step back, but not enough where it's really shaking his value too much. With or without Ridley, I would still see him as a low-end tight end one, somewhere about 8 to 10 or 12, depending on how you feel about him, how scorned you are, not just as a fantasy manager, but potentially as a Giants fan, like we all were when, not just that catch, but there felt like every week there was a near or interception caused by Evan Ingram watching a pass go right through his hands and right into the safety's mitts.
It was definitely a problem.
God, it was one of those where like it would happen in like the third quarter of a game, and you're like, oh, there it is. You almost had to set the over under of 0.5 every week for will an interception go through Evan Ingram's hands first before any defender touches it.
But sometimes it was like his 9th or 10th target because Saquon was injured, and they just again didn't have any wide receivers there, so it just wasn't a good fit, unfortunately, for Evan Ingram.
I think part of that was the Jason Garrett offense. Garrett was trying to use him
true.
like he used Jason Witten. Yeah. Run 5 yards, turn around, hitch route. And it's like, you can't use Evan Ingram like that. Jason Garrett's offense just lacked the creativity to get the most out of Evan Ingram. Doug Peterson in Jacksonville has clearly done that. And back to the original point, I don't think there's going to be a huge downtick in targets for Evan Ingram this year. I still think he'll see about the same amount of work this year that he saw last year.
Yeah. And again, if you're waiting on a tight end, he's definitely a name that there should be familiarity, whether you played against him or you had him on your team last year. He had a good season. So if you're in those later rounds and you're the last one to draft your starting tight end, definitely a name I would target. Let's briefly cover quarterback because we didn't talk about any of them, and that's okay. It's a little tough sometimes when we're talking about 1 QB, super flex, 2 QB. So let's just talk about through 5 mock drafts so far. What has been your strategy at the quarterback position? What are you trying to do this year, and what have you found yourself doing the most?
I think because the bottom of the QB1 position is not as deep as it's been in years past, I find myself using a more premium pick on a quarterback. I mentioned earlier using a second-round pick on Mahomes. Part of that was because I wanted to just ensure I had the stack of him and Kelsey and just wanted to be super aggressive with it to make sure I got that. Because that's one of those, if you try to get that Kelsey Mahomes stack, the only way you can pull it off is you take Kelsey round 1, and either you take Mahomes in round 2 a little earlier than everyone else expects you to, or you do your greatest wallflower impression. And after you take Kelsey, you try to just blend in with your surroundings, like you're a member of the Navy SEAL Team 6 or something like that. And that way, when round 3 comes around, nobody's paying attention to the draft board, and you've got your, RB1, you've got Kelsey, and then you can land Mahomes in round 3. I've taken Mahomes in round 3 as well. Usually 4 or 5 is when I've found myself taking quarterbacks, and I've tried to spread it out as much as I can. Mahomes I've taken twice, I know, and otherwise I've taken Burrow, I've taken Lamar Jackson, and another tight end quarterback stack I took as well. I took Dallas Goddard and I took Jalen Hurts in the inverse order. I took Hurts first, and a round or two later took Dallas Goddard to be a fun tight end QB stack. But I've been spending more premium picks on quarterbacks. I maybe one of the next 5, I'll do one where I force myself to wait for a quarterback. Because like I said, I'm trying to mix it up and have different draft strategies to show what your team could look like if you build it that way. But I just haven't gotten to the point yet where I've just waited and waited for a quarterback. And I think that's, like I said, there's a lot of question marks on, the low end QBs in the draft, the low end QB ones in the draft this year. Is Dak Prescott going to bounce back? Is Daniel Jones going to take that next step? Kirk Cousins is coming off the best year of his career, and he's being taken about that spot. Aaron Rodgers looked great through a couple of highlights that we saw in practice with the Jets. Is Aaron Rodgers back? So I think there's a lot more question marks in that lower tier of the draft than we've seen in years past.
Yeah, I think I'm approaching it very similarly. I know I did this mock draft series last year, and I did wait a lot, and I showed everyone like, hey, look who I'm getting here in the 13th round. This is incredible. I know I paired Trey Lance with a lot of guys last year as like a 2 QB strategy. Didn't work out, but I was getting like, I know he didn't have a good season, but I was getting Tom Brady in like the 14th round, single season career high pass attempts. So if I told you Tom Brady was going to do that, I think he'd be going a lot higher last year. Obviously, again, it didn't work out, but this year I do find myself spending a middle round pick for the most part. I have yet to pull the trigger on my guy, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, or Josh Allen. Through 5 mock drafts so far I have here, I went Lamar, Watson, Burrow, and Trevor. Trevor Lawrence I did because I waited. I tried to get like a Justin Herbert, and all of a sudden 3 quarterbacks went before my next pick. And then I succumbed to peer pressure, and I wrote that in my article because right after Trevor Lawrence, in I think the 7th or 8th round, Darren Waller went. And that's a guy that I wish I had drafted instead and waited for quarterback. But, like you mentioned, if you want to play the wallflower role and wait for Patrick Mahomes after you get Kelsey, better hope that Hurts or Allen don't go before him, because once those quarterbacks start going, I feel like everyone starts to panic and I need a quarterback. In a 1 quarterback league, 10, even 12 teams, you kind of don't, because I actually think there are some value picks later on. Do you really want to try to reach for Joe Burrow now with this calf injury, or Deshaun Watson, when you could get a quality wide receiver 3, running back 2, what have you? Or do you want to get those players and wait a little bit later for Jared Goff, Geno Smith, Aaron Rodgers? Definitely a decision to make. But I do find myself spending those middle round picks on quarterbacks right now because the players they're up against at other positions I feel good at. And I don't think any of those guys are better than the upside I'm getting from the quarterbacks in that range. Last thing I'll say on this before we end here on the fly, Anthony Richardson. This is a guy that I think all of a sudden, after watching a week and a half of camp, now the upside's always been there. We all know that, what he can do with his legs. Now Jonathan Taylor's holding in. He's at practice, but he's not practicing. Once that new contract, I don't think he's ever going to play for the Colts again based on the narratives coming out of camp. More on that, another time. But Anthony Richardson, if he doesn't have a running back like Jonathan Taylor behind him to hand off to, I think we could see, like, I don't want to say it, but we could see like a Justin Fields 2022 type season where he's running 150 times, especially when Jonathan Taylor's backup, Zach Moss, just broke his arm out 6 weeks. So if you want to reach a little bit on Anthony Richardson and pair him later with a Kirk Cousins, Daniel Jones, guy, Matt Stafford, even if you have to wait even longer, that's a strategy I would like to maybe look into in one of my mock drafts later on. I might try it out, but I don't know. It kind of depends. You got to read the room a little bit. Who likes Anthony Richardson? Who's willing to spend a high pick on him? I'm personally not right now, but 9th, 10th round might be worth the bang you get for your buck, especially if he's named the week 1 starter.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing. If he's, we discussed this in our quarterback rankings podcast a couple of weeks ago, where one of the biggest differences we had was where we ranked Anthony Richardson. And I had him way down simply because I don't know when he'll be the starter. Is it going to be week 1? Is it going to be week 8? Will it happen in year one? We could easily see Gardner Minshew, bring back the Minshew mania, and he just doesn't start his rookie year. He sits a full season. I'll say this. I saw it tweeted out earlier this week that per Kevin Bowen of 107.5, The Fan in Indianapolis, Anthony Richardson the other day in practice got all 18 starter reps. He was not splitting any starting reps at all. He got them all. If that happens and he gets named the starter before week one, I know you had him higher because you're anticipating him starting the season as QB1 or at least moving up to QB1 at some point in the early going of the season. I personally see him. I think he explodes up my board if he becomes QB. If he is named QB1 before the season starts, now we're talking about that low end QB1 tier. It gets a little deeper because I think with his rushing ability, he falls in that tier. With or without Taylor, obviously having Taylor helps in that regard. I think it opens things up more so in the passing game for him versus the running game. But I think he's a guy that he's a low end QB1 if he's the starter. Maybe then that allows me to feel a little more comfortable passing on some of those higher tier quarterbacks and taking someone that's, QB 8, 9, or 10 heading into the draft.
Yeah, I think the tier kind of breaks off for me as like top 5, 6 guys at like Lamar Fields.
Burrow getting hurt kind of nicks it a little bit. I'd want to find a guy that I think can get me through the first couple weeks of the season. But off the top of my head right now, in no particular order, Mahomes, Allen, Hurts, Lamar, Burrow,
Herbert. Did you say?
Yeah, Herbert? Justin Herbert and Trevor Lawrence is probably that like top tier for me. Burrow with his injury probably falls below Trevor Lawrence.
I'll say right now, if Anthony Richardson is named the week 1 starter when we get off this podcast,
he might be the next guy. He might be the next name on my list.
I'd be comfortable over Deshaun Watson. Why not? You could take him over Deshaun Watson, and then you can grab Matt Stafford, Jared Goff, 1 QB leagues. I'm talking here. Aaron Rodgers, you can get super late. So safe and upside. That's what I call it there. You're getting the upside of Anthony Richardson. Could end up being a top 5 guy in fantasy because of that rushing value. But if it doesn't work out like Trey Lance didn't for me last year, you have a guy that's safe on your roster like Tom Brady I had last year. But this year could be the Goffs, the Genos, the Aaron Rodgers. All right, Sean, that's going to wrap up here on the fly. Great conversation. Players we can't stop drafting. There's so much left to do in training camp, so much left to see, I should say.
We haven't even seen a preseason game yet. Tomorrow night, baby.
Tomorrow night, we got the Jets, Browns. I don't care who's out there when it's 4th, 5th, 6th string guys. I'm going to be watching. I can't wait. And then the following week, I'll actually be in Canton. Get to go to the Pro Football Hall of Fame at the.
Have you been before?
I've never been.
It's incredible. I intentionally, when I moved from New York to Missouri, deliberately made my road trip stop in Canton, Ohio for the night so I could go to the NFL Hall of Fame and then continue the road trip from there. It's a great experience.
There's really no other reason for me to go.
Yes. There really isn't much other reason to stop in Canton, Ohio. But it really is just incredible to see how they tell the history of the NFL, through the eras of each commissioner and how each of them grew the game. It's a fun, cool place. Enjoy it.
I can't wait. So, like you said, preseason game tomorrow night, Jets, Browns. That's going to kick things off. Only 3 preseason games per team. They've done away with the 4th preseason game. August 29th is like doomsday in the NFL. All of the cuts. There's only 1 cut per team, per franchise. So we're going to definitely be keeping you guys updated here on the fly when that comes around. But stick with us here at least once a week. We're going to be talking a bunch of draft strategies like we did here tonight, players we can't stop drafting. Check us out, fantraxhq.com. Sean, myself, plenty of other great writers out there are putting out content on a consistent basis. We know you have your drafts this month. We're getting you ready. So check that out. And we'll catch you next time here on The Fly. Take it easy.